Good morning, everyone. How are you? This morning of our last lecture of our UFMG Summer School on Brazilian Studies. It's been such a pleasure to have you all throughout this week, these two past weeks actually. And we are so glad that you could make it for the last day. And I hope you enjoyed it too. Today, then, we'll have a lecture and Portuguese classes. And don't forget about our luau at 2 p.m., right? So we'll have this farewell party, Brazilian style. According to Professor Davison, also Hawaiian style, right? We stole it from the Hawaiians. But anyways, now it's Brazilian too. So we are delighted and honored to have our dearest coordinator for the Summer School in Brazilian Studies, Professor Lucas Lima, who will be delivering the last lecture on Brazilian international affairs, right? And thank you so much, Professor Lucas, for the availability and for being with us. And you will enjoy this class so much. We have such delightful students, and I'm sure we'll be enlightened by your words today. Thank you ever so much, Professor Lucas. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for you muting me. Luciana, is it true that Professor Davison is going to sing Frank Sinatra this afternoon? I've heard a rumor.
Oh, I would have hoped for so.
Well, I think that you all should make pressure in the group of WhatsApp. I've heard that he's a very good Frank Sinatra singer.
What about you, Professor? What are your talents?
I'm not as talented as Professor Davison, unfortunately. But thank you for inviting me. Bom dia, pessoal. Bom dia, todo mundo. Bom dia a todos. Bom dia a todas. For me, it's a great pleasure to be here with you this morning for this class. And I am particularly happy with the outcomes and how this course has been occurring through these 2 weeks. And I'm very honored to be the last class. And that's the reason why I suggested a small homework through WhatsApp. And that's perhaps the reason why we have not as many students this morning, because when you put homework in the middle of the activity, there is a huge, not a huge, but some absence in the process. And today we are going to speak about Brazilian foreign affairs, Brazilian foreign policy, and essentially how Brazil deals with its neighbor in other states, and what are the current challenges that Brazil faces at an international level. I prepared some slides. Professor Lucas should dance. Come on, Jessica. I'm reading the chat. I usually read the chat. So I will invite you to participate through the chat, either involving your homework or other moments of participation. And at the end, I hope that we will have some time for questions. I would really appreciate to hear you. So we would follow more or less the system that we try to use during the movie club session. You can raise your hands at the end of the question, but if you have questions specific during the class, put in the chat. I know that colleagues try to answer. That is more or less the rules of the game here. Let me share the presentation I prepared for you. I think that you are, let me see here. I think that you are all seeing it. I hope so. Yes. And here it is. My name is Lucas Lima. Some of you already know me. I'm a professor of international law in the Faculty of Law, and I also have the course International Law and Politics, which deal in our minor on international studies, which deals essentially with questions of Brazilian foreign affairs and how politics, law, and the respect of it for international laws relate. And I'm very happy to discuss some of these problems that we are facing in Brazilian foreign policy right now in international level. Let me introduce myself. I'm someone that I'm not originally from Belo Horizonte. I'm not a Mineiro, and I'm from Florianópolis, a small island in the south of Brazil. Very beautiful island. The only problem there is that we only have 42 beaches, which means that when we go to the beach, we have to decide which one we go. So it's a very difficult place to live. And I advise you, for those of you that come in the next years for visiting Belo Horizonte, go and have a see in Florianópolis, which is a fantastic city colonized by Portuguese, Açorianos specifically, and it has this beautiful colonial architecture together with these wonderful beaches, which at this point, after Professor Tiago, classes of geography, you know how diverse our country is in relation to geography and colonization, and Professor Karim told you about this in the classes of Brazilian society. So I'm also glad to be the last professor, because you can rely in all the knowledges that you've acquired in the last 2 weeks to understand some of these processes that Brazil is going through at an international level. So the rules of the game in my class are quite simple. So you should not be, for those of you that are not mother tongue, you should not be shy about your language. Language is an instrument to reinforce bridges. They do not serve to reinforce towers. We know this already in different occasions. So if you want to ask questions in Portuguese, in Spanish, in French, in Italian, in German, you can use this chat for this. We will try to decodify it. So please feel free to use languages. And again, you will see for my English, I do not have a perfect English. So and I have a strong accent, especially in specific words that will appear in the next slide. So do not care that much about languages. Participate, put your ideas in the chat, in the debate afterwards. So no problem at all. Another point is there is no monopoly of good ideas, especially in the international relations. We cannot say for sure that a certain politics that is currently undergoing is the best policy. We can, of course, share ideas, test our ideas. And I think that is the philosophy of this class, testing what you've learned, testing your thoughts after 2 weeks of Brazilian foreign policy, Brazilian society. That is more or less what I'm saying here. No one is right. The point here is arguing, making the best argument for defending an idea, choosing the criteria of human rights, democracy, participation, and other. I will talk about this later. I will try not to enter in current political sensitive issues, which is quite difficult, especially because our current foreign policy is open to much criticism. But I will not enter in my class, which does not mean that you cannot ask, you cannot share your ideas, you cannot make your point during the debate or in the chat. Feel free to do as you wish in this regard. Let me find where is the chat here. Here it is, chat. Okay, I'm looking. And the last point, of course, participation is encouraged. Share your ideas, put what you think on the chat, and react to what I bring to you in these classes. I'm very curious to understand what you think about these issues. And that's the reason why I suggested a homework for you. So some of us, we do not even know what is going on in our political affairs. What is the main problem that our country is facing in international level? What are the stakes that some decisions of our leaders take? And this is a very important issue. That's the reason why I ask you to understand how your government more or less has a foreign agenda, how they project your own country in the world. And of course, if you understand what's the relation of your country with Brazil, even better. But what I'm trying to do here is to increase your awareness of your own foreign policy, through the understanding of the Brazilian foreign policy. So that is more or less the idea. And I think that in the first exercise that I brought to you, you have the occasion to share this impression. What is most important to your country right now in the world affairs? So what comes to your mind when you speak about foreign affairs? What is the main idea that you have in mind when foreign affairs, foreign policy, foreign relations is at the center stage? The first question that we can ask is about the actors. Who is responsible for conducting, for making the foreign affairs of a certain country? Who is responsible for establishing the relationship that Brazil should have with the United States, China, Argentina, or Egypt, for instance? What are the actors that we should look at? And here there is no, of course, the definitive answer. Actors are variable. Of course, we mainly look to the executive, the diplomats, to international organizations, but of course, when we look at international relations nowadays, we know that there are a plurality of actors, and we know that, for instance, civil society has a strong say. ONGs or NGOs, non-governmental organizations, they can influence public debate. We know that the relation of a country with another does not pass necessarily only through the main official levels. We have migration, we have other forms of cooperation, we have universities trying to foster the relationship between countries. So actors are important. It's important to know who are the actors responsible for conducting foreign affairs. The main answer, the state and its diplomats and its official agents, but not only. And that is an important thing to clarify at the beginning of our classes. Second point, what is the purpose of foreign affairs? What is and what ought to be the objectives of conducting foreign affairs? What a country is looking for when he invests in specific actions in relation to other states? What is the main idea? And Brazil has a specific idea, what it wants to have with its foreign affairs, with its diplomacy. So it's quite clear that foreign affairs, foreign relations, we have a specific function, and usually states have interests. And this is, of course, connected to the fact that every state has its own perception, what is its function at international level, and how it is perceived by the other states and by other countries, which changes from government to government, which changes according to the moment in history, which changes according to national level. If you look at the different governments that Brazil had in the last 20 years or 40 years, you will see that the foreign policy is variable. And this changeable character of foreign policy is important to understand and assess a country's foreign policy. For instance, which criteria should we use in order to say that Brazil has a good or bad foreign policy? Brazil is achieving its interest. Brazil is growing as a nuclear power. Brazil is growing, the answer is no for the last one. Brazil is growing as a regional power. Brazil is getting more insertion in the international economy. All these are good indicators to evaluate the impact of a certain foreign policy. And again, how we understand what is going on, what are the sources that we should look at to understand a certain foreign policy. And the answer here is we should look at official documents. We should understand what is going on in the main. That's the reason why I suggest you to enter the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There you can understand how a country officially project itself. Of course, that sometimes there has been a difference between the discourse and the practice of a certain country. But right now, for us, for students, for academics, I think a good way to understand foreign policy of a certain country is to look at journal and newspapers, to read what is going on in your own country and how you react to the interest, how a certain government react to a difficult problem that is arising in a certain part of the world. For instance, pandemic, for instance, the situation in Venezuela, the situation in Syria, the situation in Iran. This is important to understand how a certain country projects itself. That are more or less some preliminary remarks. And I would like to start my class telling you about 5 current challenges / problems of Brazilian foreign affairs. What are at stake right now? What are the challenges that we need to put some emphasis at? If you were our head of diplomacy, where would you put your attention? And I would say, I will show to you how 5 different situations in Brazilian foreign affairs can be very important to define our relation and how we are perceived by the other states in the international community. First problem, and the first issue, that Brazil is a strong actor and has a say in international level, or had a say in international level, is environment. You are perhaps all aware of this very famous photograph of a monkey burned in the Pantanal fires. We are having problems in Amazonia of deforestation and some fires in Amazon also. And last year, you could see the smoke from Pantanal arriving at São Paulo and even some cities of Minas Gerais, which gives us all this awareness of how strong and how problematic environmental problems are and can affect Brazilian foreign policy. Why? First, environment is a question that is at the end of the day of international agenda. You all know that we are facing a climate change crisis. You all know that there has been a problem in relation to how is the expression? You have this strong heat caused by climate changes, and this is changing all the world. And since Brazil has a strong say in these issues, either because it has biodiversity, the Amazon, Pantanal, and different biospheres and different contributions to the environment, you have, of course, pressure from other states, and the relation with other states can influence how we solve this problem. You probably know that Brazil and France had strong disagreements. President Macron is one of the most strong voices criticizing Brazil and Brazilian policies regarding the environment, and this, of course, can be tackled. The way that we deal with our environmental problems does not only influence how we have a relationship with other states and how they perceive our politics, more or less as a harm to the world environment, but you have another problem, that is part of the solution can come with cooperation with other states, which is exactly this essay in the Foreign Policy magazine that says that China is a potential solution for our problems. And this is, of course, problematic, since even if China is the most important economic partner of Brazil right now, we also have the problem that there has been some criticism regarding China's policies, and the current government is not necessarily a good friend of China because of its alignment with the US. So this is important to understand what is going on known around the world, and Brazil's role in the environment is a crucial one for all the reasons that at this point you already know from our college classes. But environment is not only our only problem. We have a strong problem of human rights going on in Brazil, and human rights can, of course, be extended to refugee crisis, as you can see in the image. We now are facing the lowest level of freedom of press in recent Brazilian history because of a number of threats to Brazilian democracy and Brazilian press, fake news, and so on and so forth. If you are interested in this topic, you can see the beautiful openness conference of last summer school from Patricia Campos Melo, and she talked how she explained to us how Brazilian freedom of press and freedom of expression is under threat right now. And of course, you have problem not only of refugees, but basic conditions of equality and not respecting inequality. In 2020, at the beginning of this year, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the regional level responsible for assessing, controlling, and supervising human rights in the continent, he released, the organ released a report that assessed how is the situation of human rights in Brazil. And the situation, if you look at this report, it's available online. It's interesting to understand how different areas of human rights are involved. You will see how human rights, this is some topic that Professor Juliana Alvini has already discussed with you. I will not enter that much, but if you look at the report, look at one of the conclusions. It says that 23 years after its first visit to Brazil, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights ascertained that Brazil has a democratic system governed by the rule of law with robust democratic and human rights institutions. That seems good, right? Nevertheless, the country continues to be characterized by extreme social inequality based on, I have to change this position of here again, okay. Based on structurally embedded discrimination against persons of African descent and traditional Quilombola and indigenous communities. Professor Cristiano talked to you about this topic. Campesinos and rural workers, the poor, street people, women, and LGBTIQ plus persons. Here you have all the minorities that have strong problems in Brazilian society nowadays. You have seen this in Professor Corina's class, but the point is here that if we don't have some problems that are more common to European and Asian countries of minorities, ethnic minorities that want independence, now we have here problems regarding a lot of minorities that have problems accessing basic human rights. As the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights sees it, the concentration of wealth and the discrimination based on race, social origin, sex and gender stereotypes, sexual orientation and age led to the historical exclusion of those groups who, year after year, continue to live in extremely vulnerable conditions. The perception of how a country treats its minorities, it's important for a certain groups of states that want to promote human rights in the agenda, and this affects necessarily the Brazilian foreign relations. So this is an important issue that Brazil has to tackle in order to enhance its prestige, enhance its reputation, because as you can see here, and as you have saw in other classes, as you have seen in other classes, this is a problem, is a structural problem of Brazil that needs to be tackled. Connected to human rights, but also an important challenge that the UN characterizes as one of the big problems of current society is gender equality. You probably know this is a very sad data that 4 girls are raped every hour in Brazil, finds a specific study. This is it's a news published in the CNN in 2019. I don't think the situation has improved much since then. But we have problems of not only structural problems of gender imbalance that affects employment, that affects the recognition of women in Brazilian society, but we have also the hardest part of our of this gender inequality that is at the basis of everything, that are feminicide, that is the question of abortion. You know that abortion in Brazil is not completely legal, only in 2 or 3 occasions, differently from Argentina, which legalized abortion very recently. So gender equality is a problem in Brazilian society that usually is treated in connection with human rights, but I think that is a strong problem that faces half of the population, and we have a lot of situations right now in Brazil that claims our attention to deal with it, and this is again an important indicator for Brazilian foreign affairs. Brazil needs to tackle these problems in order to be recognized as a country that has a specific reputation or has the leadership that it aims to have. Let's look at what the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights Inter-American Commission of Human Rights from the Organization of American States said about gender equality. In our examinations as the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, of the human rights situations in Brazil, gender proves to be a factor exacerbating the inequality and the discrimination underlying the structural process of human rights violations in the country. Male chauvinism, which we call machismo in Portuguese, and misogyny continues to relegate women to an inferior position in the economy and in public affairs, with marked differences in wages and in the labor market, and underrepresentation in parliament and other branches of government, and above all in senior positions. And we can see that also in diplomacy. The discrimination reinforces socioeconomic and ethnic racial inequalities, which lie at the heart of Brazilian failure to realize human rights. So how we want to be a country that is a leader in the region and in the world if basic human rights are not in the best situation, are not respected, and have strong difficulties. Another issue that we could say that is an important and very important issue that international level can have a say, and international cooperation can have a say, is the question of economy and development. You probably know that Brazil faced many crises, and now is under a government that has some neoliberal or liberal policies. But Brazil, in its history of foreign affairs, have faced either support from international agencies such as the International Monetary Fund, and Brazil needs to tackle some of problems that the economic side, at the end of the day, influences how Brazil can be an economic actor that participates in the global change of production. And this, of course, Brazil has a current ambition that is to participate at the OECD, the Organization of Economic Development, which is usually informally called as the Club of Rich. That has many policies that a country should adapt in order to enter, to participate, to have a say at the table in all this shaping of these policies. And Brazil has been, in recent times, working on adapting new legislation reforms to enter these specific regulations to participate in the big club of rich countries or developed countries, which is not very easy, specifically because these kind of regulations sometimes need structural changes in Brazil that are not that our legal system is not prepared for adapt. You probably know that during the 90s, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the Brazilian president, was responsible for mainly important reforms to adapt Brazil, to open Brazil after 20 years of closeness and isolation, some isolation from other problems. But you see, if we do not open, if we do not prepare our market correctly, and if we do not arrange ourselves with our neighborhoods, we lose good opportunities, such as the current Brazil, Mercosur, European Union agreement, trade deal. That is one of these trade deals that are negotiated in the European Union that would have a huge impact in Brazilian economy. That, you probably know that, Brazil is one of the responsibles for not advancing this agreement because the environmental problems and environmental criticism Brazil faces from European Union and from France and Germany specifically, but other countries also. So see how international subjects are connected, and that is influential in a country's projection economically, politically, and in the participation of the big forums of international decision making. Economy is something that Brazil needs to work. The right to development is something that Brazil needs to work better in order to have a better position in the world community. The last topic that I brought to you, here I told a very recent news from the Financial Times that demonstrates that Uruguay is not very well aligned with Mercosur policies and is looking for ordinary blocks and trade deals, which means that Uruguay is not leaving, but not putting the main emphasis in Mercosur. And this is, in my opinion, an immediate consequence on how Brazil is dealing with Mercosur, how the other partners are dealing with Mercosur, and this influences the future of the bloc and the future of the economy of the bloc and the international participation of this global chains of production. The last topic that I brought to you that is very important to our specific understanding of Brazilian role is regional security. Traditionally, Brazil is seen as an intermediary power, a leader in the region that can intermediate and can be not only a leader, but also a good neighborhood that usually is heard in sensitive situations. Now, the region is facing a problem in Haiti. You have seen that last week, the president of Haiti was murdered, and this is a reflect of the situation in the country. Brazil had a strong participation in this with this partner because he sent military personnel during the help that the United Nations gave to Haiti in the 2003 to 2012, more or less. And now we have other situations that can become a threat to international peace and security, and the situation in Venezuela can be perceived in one of the main problems in this regard that is responsible for the refugee crisis that we are facing. We have refugees right now in Belo Horizonte, which is in the center of Brazil, which means that migration from Venezuela reaches the south of Chile, the center of Brazil, the south of Brazil. We had migrations from Haiti also. So these problems are interconnected, and Brazilian policy in these regards are quite influential. So what role should Brazil should focus its attention? Our current policy in relation to this point is Brazil is supporting Guaidó government, saying that Maduro government is an illegitimate government. And this is, of course, exacerbating the tensions in the region. I imagine that you know that US is not thinking about intervening anymore as it occurred in the Trump administration, where the possibility of an intervention from the US was considered strongly. But right now, how Brazil focuses its policies in relation to its neighborhoods and how Brazil wants to intervene can have an impact on how the neighbors perceive Brazil. So let's imagine this situation. I would really like to have your answers in the chat. Let's imagine that you are a diplomat from your country. Do not forget your national background right now. Do not forget your homework. And if you are Brazilian, this is not a problem. But what would you be if you have the rare occasion to make a discourse regarding what role Brazil should have, what you expect from Brazil, what would be the problem that would you say that is most important to be tackled urgently? What would you say that it would be the most pressing issue that you should pay attention at, and you should immediately say, Brazil, you need to focus your attention in this problem because this is a world problem? So please answer in the chat just to give me an idea from what is your own perception: environment, human rights, economy and development, security, or gender equality. What would you say? I expect your answers in the chat. I'm looking at it, and you have, I don't know, 1 minute. We have already Julian, environmental problems. What else would you say? Human rights, environment, security, environment, human rights, environment. No one is so worried about economy, apparently. Public health. Public health is an important. I think this is subjective to what it's relation to, but economy and development, in my view, will also have. I agree with you. It's subjective, but this is the point that I want to make. Human rights, environment. There is some subjective level to decide what is completely urgent in someone's agenda. Economy, you see, Albrecht find it, okay, these are two that I would say that are important, which is completely normal. You can, of course, if you are a leader, giving a speech regarding Brazil, human rights, human rights, human rights. Human rights is a very important issue, I agree with you. And some would say, we cannot tackle human rights while our economy is suffering, which I do not know if it's a good necessary argument. Interesting, Pascal, opinion about German Minister of Foreign Affairs. Human rights, humanitarian aid, civilian crisis prevention. That's very interesting, Pascal. I really like that answer. Environment. Environment is, I'm not surprised that many of you say environment. Global health. Global health, I did not put it here because it's part of the following question, but yes. Public health, global health, it's interesting. What we can see from this very short interaction that we had in the chat, we can have different interests according to specific and subjective policies around the world. It's changeable. These interests are changeable, and it depends upon the bigger picture and how a certain country has more specific policies. For instance, in general, Europe is quite concerned right now about the question of environment, as it is the US, which is not necessarily the same question that other countries in the world look at Brazil and say, I prefer to have a better economy because this is a consequence. So who is right, who is wrong? That's not the point here. No one is right or wrong. This is a question of opinion. There is no monopoly of good ideas. And I think that the point here is proved. You can have different interests, as it is legal security. Legal security, no, the regional security. Regional security is quite important. If you think about the history of international relations and how the United Nations was essentially made to assure security, peace and security in the world, and after that, after you agree that you will not have no war, you can work on other problems. You have a good argument to say that legal security, that regional security is important because Brazil is one of the big players in the region, and what Brazil is going to do perhaps can have an influence in other players in the region. I'm not saying that Brazil is the boss. That's not my point. My point is that how a country leads its foreign policy may inspire other models, especially from its neighbors, because nowadays international relations tends to be more focused on regional problems that go to the bigger problems. And that's the reason why you said environment, because it's good to have different people interested. I completely agree with you, Jadi. And the point here, I forgot my point, but I will give you another problem, how these interests may change from a specific topic, from new situations. For instance, your priorities in relation to another state might change abruptly, and some of you have already anticipated my argument. If you have a global emergence that blocks the global chains, that blocks traveling, that is threatening the whole world, you change abruptly your foreign policy, and the criticism that you are going to have and how the other countries will look at you is if you can be a good partner providing vaccine technology and support for solving this problem, and if you are a threat, if you are dealing adequately with these problems in your territory, and if you do not pose a threat to others, because if you are a threat, people will not allow you to travel, people will not allow you to make commerce, and all these problems suffer. Imagine right now Haiti, which has a strong political crisis, an international crisis, and is dealing with pandemic because it is one of the countries that has the lowest level of vaccines. So this changes abruptly the situation, as it happens in the past. In a certain moment, Brazilian foreign policy, look at Iran and the situation in the Middle East and said, now we want to support what is happening in relation to Iran's nuclear program, which nowadays is one of the strongest threats to the balance of the relations in the world. So this is not the current politics of Brazil in relation to this. Brazil has refrained to participate more actively in the Middle East as a global leader. But when Brazil decided to support Iran's nuclear program and not the right to have nuclear weapons, that's not what Brazil said. But this also changed the world. So international relations, foreign policy can change abruptly. So my remarks here, I am very happy that your interaction, I'm very happy what you said in chat. We have some points to make here. That is, the relationship between states and other actors cannot be reduced. They are plural, complex, and changeable, because all these 5 issues, but many more issues, are in the pandemic, are at the table at the same time, and the government needs to focus sometimes in one or another, but a country needs to deal with all these problems together, and that is a great challenge. Of course, I reduced the argument here in order to make my point, but these are very complex situations. My second point to you is foreign policy is only one, but a very important aspect of national politics. It's difficult to understand one without other. You cannot understand the Brazil's role in the world nowadays without understanding the Bolsonaro government. And it's difficult to understand a specific foreign policy without having the bigger picture, without understanding that right now we are facing a competition between US, China, and Russia. We are dealing with questions of human rights, we're dealing with questions of trade wars, and this is something that Brazil has to decide what would be its specific policy, who would be the immediate allies that Brazil would choose. For instance, and there is another thing, the subtleties of foreign affairs. Sometimes you have to choose these values to be emphasized, even if you emphasize a little or you do not put some emphasis. For instance, you probably know that Brazilian environmental international policy has been more timid in the last years because Brazil did not think that it would be interesting to promote these values abroad while specific domestic policies underway. So if you look at a certain country, you will discover that sometimes there is some emphasis, as let me open the chat again, as Pascal put in the chat, there are some priorities. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs put some words out and others don't. And you have to understand why. And in order to understand this, you have to understand a specific politics. So the shape of foreign affairs, the bigger picture where Brazil is right now. And if you were a Brazilian diplomat, of course, you would have a specific view of which of these alliances would be the best alliance to be pursued. Alliance with the United States, that during the Trump government was more intense, as we will see. An alliance with China, which is one of the emerging powers in the world. An alliance with China and other emerging powers from the global south, even if you can discuss it. What is the meaning of global south nowadays, which is represented by the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Is this the best alliance, or our allies are not so interested in this specific alliance? Or should Brazil put the focus in the regional and America and reinforce its ties with Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Venezuela, Chile, Peru, and other, Bolivia, and other neighbors that are growing economies and have, of course, also growing problems that through cooperation could be tackled. Again, here it's a question of choosing, and it's not clear what are the criteria that one should use in order to choose. And in order to understand that, we should use some elements that will guide our decision making and will guide our choose for alliances, and we do that understanding a little bit of how Brazil perceived itself from history, how Brazil foreign governments behave or have chosen its allies in the past. And this is important to understand Brazil as an actor in the international scene. And I will make a presentation of this first part, then we have another part of participation, and then we will open for the debate. Here you can have some images of this different approaches that Brazil had sometimes. You have the flirting with China during the 60s. We have Barão do Rio Branco, one of the main figures of Brazilian diplomacy. It's the bald man in the top of the slide. And he was I will talk about him in a few minutes. We have our president during the dictatorship with Jimmy Carter. We have Dilma with Angela Merkel in a soccer match during the World Cup. And of course, we have Lula with Obama, where Obama said, this is the guy, he is the guy, which is something that we never had in our specific relation, but with the US, and I will deal with our relationship with the US. Again, here I had to make choices. I cannot cover 200 years since the beginning of the Brazil as a nation in the independence. I cannot cover 200 years of history of foreign affairs. You can find this information elsewhere, but I will make some points that reinforce the main argument that I'm trying to make to you nowadays, that what is Brazil's perception of itself, what have been Brazilian alliances, what have been Brazilian challenges regarding these 5 areas that I showed to you, specifically how we can understand this specific situation, how Brazil should put himself in the current options that are at stake, and see that here that there are a lot of elements missing. And I will explain you why there are some elements that, for instance, you as a foreigner, as a Brazilian, as a student of Brazilian Brazilian issues, you already are asking, what about is your specific relation of your specific country with Brazil? So let's talk very quickly about the 19th century, where Brazil became independent, and Brazil broke ties with a kingdom, the kingdom of Portugal and Algarves, and at the time there was an empire of Portugal, and of course embraced another empire in the 19th century. Is a specific a century of a relationship of Brazil with the United Kingdom, England specifically, and how Brazil left from Portuguese influence and embraced English influence. And at the time, one of the main important facts that occurred was the last big war which Brazil was directly involved with, which Brazil not only sent troops, but was responsible for being one of the leaders of the war, is the War of the Triple Alliance with Paraguay, where Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay enter in war against Paraguay. And you know that this is one of the sensitive issues in our history, because some say that there occurred a genocide over there. I'm not sure if a genocide is the word that we should use, but the atrocities that occurred in that war are a sad and bleak moment in our history of foreign relations. And there you can find some of this criticism, what has been called as Brazilian imperialism. Some of our neighborhoods, some group of intellectuals within our neighborhoods called Brazil as an imperialist power in the continent, and this is particularly connected with this relationship with Paraguay in the Triple Alliance War. The point here to be kept in mind is Brazil was a nation that was influenced by its former metropole and colony, and then it came under the influence of the big power in the world at the time. And this explains why in the 20th century, the big quest of Brazil is a quest for autonomy, independence, and recognition as an autonomous power. Since England, since the United Kingdom was the prevalent European force at the time in Latin America, but there were others, you probably know that the Monroe Doctrine was in the beginning of the century, the end of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century. The Monroe Doctrine was the idea that America should be governed by Americans, which means that it was the moment to break ties with Europe and embrace the politics from the US that was growing as a big regional power at the time, not yet the most important power competing with the Soviet Union. And one of the main important characters of this change was the Baron of Rio Branco. Rio Branco was a Brazilian diplomat. He is considered the father or the godfather of Brazilian diplomacy. Until nowadays, the Brazilian Foreign Ministry is called as the House of Rio Branco. And in the period that he was the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a lot of things happened. For instance, Brazil settled most part of its frontier with its neighbors through pacific means, not through wars. Brazil used arbitration and negotiation to settle all these frontiers, recognizing a very solid and no problematic question of frontiers until nowadays. Brazil has no problem regarding frontiers that we can see in other parts of the world, for instance. And this is all thanks to Rio Branco, that endured this idea that diplomacy as a profession. He was serving the state, he served different presidents, but he continued as the foreign minister because he had this idea that his work is not serving a specific government, but he was serving the Brazilian state. And in this moment, other than adhere to international instruments for settling disputes, such as arbitration and negotiation for settling frontiers, Brazil started its debut in international world scene when Brazil sent delegates to participate in one of the first multilateral meetings. Is the charge in my right side of the screen, where you had Rui Barbosa, one of the big politicians at the time. He was also considered a diplomat, and he went to The Hague. He went to dialogue with European powers, and European, of course, other powers, but essentially was a European convention, and he defended the equality of states. States are equal, states, even if they are bigger or smaller, the logic of power, the logic of potências, a puissance, was not an idea that Brazil should embrace. So he defended that all states are equal and should be equal before the international level, which is an idea that Latin American states are quite fond of. And this is an important principle that Brazil defended at the time. So it was a good debut in Brazilian foreign relations. But especially another point that Rio Branco was responsible for was embracing the Monroe Doctrine. At the time, Rio Branco has perceived the US as the good alliance to have in order to avoid European influences in the continent, and it was there was an aspiration to mimicking the US in the region. So the idea was, okay, if the US is our main protector in the Americas, Brazil would be a power that should be looked at in the region, in the South region, because it is the strongest power, because it is big enough, because its frontiers are already settled. So this is the beginning of a strong relationship with the US, and here we embraced the Monroe Doctrine, and Rio Branco was responsible. And this is the one reason why still nowadays US is one of the most, if not the most important partner in our foreign relations. This is a long relationship that, of course, had some problems in its conduction, but is a very consistent relationship that Brazil has developed, and Rio Branco was responsible for this changing. Rio Branco, as I told you, is responsible for what we call the Itamaraty. For those of you that know a little bit about Brazilian foreign policy, you have heard already about the Itamaraty. Itamaraty is how we called informally the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Itamaraty is the old palace that was donated by Barão do Itamaraty, another nobleman in Brazilian society, that gave his house, gave a huge palace to host the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and that is why we call the Itamaraty a synonym to our Minister of Foreign Affairs. The Itamaraty, from the Rio Branco until nowadays, is one of the most important organs of Brazilian society, not only in the conducting of foreign affairs, but the Itamaraty is an important organ of Brazilian public function. Here is the old headquarters of Itamaraty in Rio de Janeiro with the palm trees, and the new headquarters in Brasilia, in the Itamaraty Palace. They continue the tradition of calling Itamaraty, and Itamaraty is still nowadays how we refer to Brazilian Foreign Ministry and this diplomatic corps that we were quite influenced by France and European diplomatic corps. Itamaraty was not only connected in conducting international foreign affairs, but also conducting the politics of Brazilian state. The important decisions are usually passed through Itamaraty. And Itamaraty have been developed a motto since the beginning of its functions, that is, we serve the state, we do not serve government. The governments change, the Brazilian state continue, and we serve the Brazilian interest to become a power, to use foreign policy to assure its development. And Brazil has a natural leadership in the world affairs, and Itamaraty is responsible. Our foreign policy is an instrument for guaranteeing Brazilian natural leadership in the world scene. Autonomy, prestige, and assuring Brazilian development are three of the key values of this important organ that is a constant in every piece of our history. Because, as probably some of you know, and especially the Brazilians one, the public competition to enter Itamaraty is the most difficult competition in Brazilian public service nowadays. The salary is way good, and you usually have to study 3 or 4 years in order to enter the service, where you study diplomatic languages. Every Brazilian diplomat speaks at least 4 languages, 4 or 5 languages, because this is a necessary content of the course. Itamaraty is a well-prepared body of public servants that conduct the foreign policy, and that the prestige of Itamaraty has to do with its composition and the men and women that serve in Itamaraty till nowadays. So usually that's a rule. Brazilian diplomats are well prepared, are quite well prepared, and if you contact colleagues from other diplomatic corpses, they would say they would say that Brazilian Itamaraty is one of the best trained and well prepared for representing Brazil's interests in world affairs. You have to understand economy, politics, Brazilian history with a huge level of detail. So that's one of the explanations why Brazil has a very good performance in international affairs throughout its history. Okay, having said this, let's understand what happened after the first years of our foreign policy. And we had, after the crack of the New York wars, we had a very particular situation in our foreign policy. In our picture, you have already studied with Professor Scopacasa the Estado Novo and the Vargas era, but the Estado Novo and the Vargas era was responsible for a strong development in industry and settling Brazil as one of the strongest allies of the US. Why? Because we had a strong crisis, we needed new markets, and we need to diversify our exports that were main bases in raw materials and coffee, and as you already have seen it in Professor Patricia's class. And what happened there, it was the industry of Brazil needed some development. It needed iron and steel, and in order to guarantee these important materials and to guarantee the industry, Brazil played a gamble. Vargas played a gamble with bargaining with the two powers. At a certain moment in the beginning of the tensions in Europe during the Second World War, Vargas was in the between Germany and the US. And in a certain moment, Vargas decided to go with the US because steel industry was the price. It was the price that US President Franklin Roosevelt offered to Brazil. You can see him in the photo. And at that moment, Brazil became a very important ally of the US. Brazil was considered at the time to become one of the members of the permanent members of the Security Council, but it faces some resistance either from by the Soviet Union at the time and from some other powers in the region. So Brazil goes to war. Brazil sends some men to war to fight with the allies. But the foreign policy at the time was an instrument for guaranteeing the development of the industry, guaranteeing Brazilian economic development that was needed after the crisis. Brazil was an important actor at the San Francisco Conference and the drafting of the Charter. Brazil was a very important regional player in the shaping of this organization, and another organization that is the Organization of American States. Till nowadays, there has been some different perception of the whole role of the Organization of American States, but Brazil was certainly one of the shapers of this institution as it is until nowadays. Vargas was so famous that he gained his own character in the Civilization 6 game, and he was responsible for this defining of foreign policy in a huge amount of time in our political and international history. After the war, this idea of alignment, this idea of alliance with the US was a little bit shaken by some new ideas, especially when immediately after the war, the competition between the US and the Soviet Union in the Cold War was so strong that the US did not pay the right attention to Brazil. And during the Dutra government, we had what was called as alignment without rewards. Dutra, it was a general, he said, okay, we will align to the US. US is an important ally. We should keep our friendship with the US, but the US at the time was most focused on avoid and reconstructing Europe, doing a Marshall Plan for Europe, and there was this sense of for the Brazilians at the time, the Brazilian authorities at that time said, okay, I'm aligned with you, I embraced all your ideas, I'm your representative in the region, but you're not helping me to achieve development and economy. What happened at the time was that Brazil entered what was called with Juscelino Kubitschek, what was a mineiro, as you already know. Juscelino Kubitschek was one of the first presidents to develop the idea of Pan-American operation, which was focus in the relations of the American states. We should look at the solution of the problems, not in the international context of Cold War, but we should look at what is happening in our continent. And Juscelino Kubitschek was responsible for increasing the, as you know, increasing the foreign debt, but he promoted development, industry, and specific infrastructure reforms in Brazil. He constructed a new capital. He was responsible. He was a very popular president in the beginning of his government, exactly because he represented an alternative, the beginning of an alternative. He was, of course, well aligned with the US, but he was opening to other alliances. He was focusing on our neighborhoods and how Brazilian South Cone could face the challenges of development that they were facing at the time without entering the Cold War. Since the Dutra government, they had already more or less, they were more or less regretting the alignment without rewards. And this idea developed of in the foreign policy reached its greatest point in what was called the Política Externa Independente, the independent foreign policy of Brazil that occurred essentially under the presidency of Jânio Quadros and João Goulart. And at the time, as you can see here, this Brazilian government said Brazilian government did not enter the logic of non-alignment completely, but flirted with the idea when it looked for other powers to establish relations and to develop relations. Brazilian government, Brazilian Vice President, at the time President João Goulart went to China. The relation with Cuba was in development, and at the time we had this idea of new partners, new markets, no direct alignment. This is what has been called the Política Externa Independente. There are some focal points that until nowadays are very important points, important values of Brazilian foreign policy. That is independence, the idea of we have to achieve development, and the foreign policy is an instrument to reach our development. The idea of self-determination. In this time, we were having in Africa, in Asia, this movement stimulated by the UN of the new states coming from colonies reaching. If you consider that at the time that the UN was founded, there was 62 countries in the world, or better, 61 members, and nowadays you have 193 members. You know that this gap has been fulfilled with new independent states coming from the colonization. Brazil supported this view and supported the view of self-determination as an important principle of foreign relations. Non-intervention, this is something that came since the Rio Branco Baron, the idea that intervention is not something allowed in Latin America. Intervention is not something that Latin American countries believe, and this is of course connected with the idea of self-determination and the idea of decolonization that should be developed. Brazil, for instance, in 1955, during the Bandung Conference that occurred in Asia, of the meeting of Asian and African countries of non-alignment and stimulating the self-determination and decolonization, Brazil sent observers and Brazil participated in the debate. So Brazil was interested in this agenda at the times. And these principles are principles that are still nowadays conducting our foreign policy. But this ended in 1964 when we enter in a military dictatorship that changed completely our Brazilian foreign policy in this regard. So right now I will make a pause in this long and perhaps a little bit boring history, and I would like to invite you to participate in our class and to test your knowledge, to see how good do you know, how well do you know Brazilian international presence in the world affairs, and you just have to answer in the chat true or false. That's quite interesting. But let's see how good is your perception of Brazilian foreign presence with interesting and not so interesting, perhaps sometimes sad facts. Let me open this here. I have to see the chat. I hope you are not sleeping yet. Some of you perhaps are. Okay, let me see. Where are you? Here you are. Okay, prepare yourselves. Let's see how good you know Brazilian foreign policy. Thank you, Luciana, for demonstrating your enthusiasm for my class. The Baron of Rio Branco acquired Acre, a region in northern Brazil, trading for a horse with Bolivia. Is it true or false? You have the chat for your false. True. Whoa, tough. True. I have no idea. Of course. True. There is a lot of figures. It's true. It belonged to Bolivia, but I don't know if it was only a horse. It was some more nuance. No idea. The answer is more or less. Being Brazil, I would say true. Unfortunately, this is not true. Brazil did not trade it for a horse. What happened at the time, if you look at the historical sources, this is a urban legend. We used to say, especially people in the south and the northeast of Brazil, that Acre was bought for trading it for a horse. But that is not specifically true. It was not. The Tratado de Pretópolis is right, Isabella, but it was not the price of a horse. Brazil acquired the region. Some say that at the time there was the fact that the Brazilian diplomat involved in the negotiation knew that the Brazilian governor at the time, the Bolivian governor at the time, was very fond of horses, and it gave him a horse that is a very rare horse, a very specific horse from I don't know, a sophisticated race. And this fact gained public debate and became a anecdote, but Brazil did not buy it for a horse. Some say that it was the price of this very rich and very expensive horse, but this is not true as I formulated here. Let's go to the second question. Brazil broke relations with Cuba during the dictatorial regime. Is that true or false? True, 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 true. Okay, the majority seems to go to the true answer, which is of course true at the time. If there is this is a good anecdote that a brilliant student of mine told me, that apparently when there was the voting at the Organization of American States to suspend Cuba or not in the 60s, the Brazilian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Santiago Dantas, was there to vote, and apparently he was going to vote to remain neutral, because Brazil decided during that time to remain neutral without an alignment to the US. And what happened is that US government made enough pressure to convince the president at the time, Jango, João Goulart, Jânio Quadros, to change the position. And the Brazilian president said, okay, let's change the positions, let's vote against Cuba. And at the time, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Brazil, Santiago Dantas, he said, I will not, I know what he is calling for. There was no WhatsApp at the time. I know why he's calling, and I will not answer to his call. And Brazil voted to remain neutral in the Organization of American States suspension of Cuba, expulsion of Cuba. However, in '64, after the military regime entered into force, started to govern Brazil, Brazil decided to break relations with Cuba because it was a communist country. The threat of communism in Brazil was already controlled with the military government. I'm using my ironical poetic sense here. And Brazil broke relations with Cuba. So here we have another point in Brazilian history, that is, in 1965, Brazil helped the invasion of the Dominican Republic that was conducted by US. True or false? The immediate answer is false, right? Because Brazil was defending non-intervention, right? True, false, true. True. No idea. There is always a no idea. I choose random facts exactly to stimulate those of you that have no idea. And this is true. This is true. Brazil helped at the time to show his alignment with the US in 1965, in the beginning of the military dictatorship. Brazil sent 1,000, 2,000 men to Dominican Republic in the intervention that US was conducting. So this was one of the very few occasions where Brazil intervened in a country, and this occurred during the military dictatorship, which is an illustration of which kind of foreign policy we were conducting at the time. Let's see the next information. In 1982, during the Falkland Malvinas War, Brazil secretly supported the United Kingdom. True or false? True, false. I love when you all do not go in the same direction, because this is true, true, false. We are in a match. Let's see where the majority goes. False, false, false. Yes, the false is winning, because this is actually false. Brazil tried to be neutral at the time, because it was a conflict between its neighbors and an ally, but secretly Brazil supported Argentina, allowing some military personnel and military equipment to go through Brazilian ports and reach Argentina. So Brazil, in this moment, in 1982, Brazil more or less recovered its alliance with Argentina, which during the 70s was threatened by the issue of Itaipu. It was a good maneuver for strengthening relationship with a neighbor, an important neighbor, without going against its general politics of neutrality in this conflict. So it is false. Let's talk about another long-standing conflict. Is Maradona better than Pillai? True or false? This is an important, that's a very important, false, true, false. I like the falses because this seems that you are more or less aligning with Brazilian very important querellas, the king. For those of you that answer true, I'm very sad to announce that we will not get the certificate of our summer school. I'm of course kidding. I have no power for do that. Only if you don't do your homework at Twitter. That's the only way that I can. We cannot give you the certificate. However, they are very good friends, and this is a Pelé-Maradona relationship is an example of how soft power and how other issues rather than national politics can define the relationship of two countries. And if you go to YouTube, you will find two very important pieces of demonstration how this is an important issue for Brazilian countries during the World Cup. We had Argentinians singing the Brasil decime que se siente, and there was a very provocative song about Brazil, and one of these phrases are Maradona es más grande que Pelé. Maradona is bigger than Pelé. This is the most important querella that we had with our neighbor, and of course saudades de uma Copa. Of course, I've seen some videos yesterday preparing some these classes, and I said, that video of Brazilians in the metro of Moscow is a beautiful video of Copa also. I advise you to. And of course, there was the Brazilian answer. You see, some I just noticed you. Okay, Jessica, come on, do not expose. Jessica, are you playing a game against me? Okay, you should look at these videos after the class because these are very nice videos and it demonstrates how we behave with our good neighbors in some specific issues. Carnaval, there is a long time there is no carnival. So is it true or false? A Brazilian minister stopped the UN General Assembly and made Secretary General Kofi Annan to dance and play with him. True or false? True. Come on, this is a stereotype of Brazil. True. Gilberto Gil, that is also, of course, true. This is one of another. Yes, Victoria, this is true. This is another beautiful scene that you should look at YouTube at the end of this class, because you have Gilberto Gil singing this beautiful song that is Toda Menina Baiana. I don't know if you are going to sing this class, this song in the luau in this afternoon, but it's a beautiful song, which is more or less Toda menina baiana tem santo que Deus dá. Toda menina baiana tem encantos que Deus dá. Toda menina baiana tem jeito que Deus dá. Toda menina baiana tem defeitos também que Deus dá. Que Deus deu, que Deus dá. And this is my contribution to the Luau, Luciana. Here it is. You should see this video because this video is just fantastic. When he said, please, Kofi Annan, come and play, and the Secretary General of the United Nations come and start to play with Gilberto Gil. This is one of the best, thank you, Kenneth. This is one of the best moments of Brazilian soft diplomacy. Another question to you, true or false? The King of Spain, Juan Carlos, saved a former Brazilian First Lady forgotten by her husband within a hose rise. Is it true or false? True, false. Sophia says false. Ursula says false. Could be true, says Simi. Victoria, Joanna, probably true. False, false. Icaro said it's false. Probably true, says Leticia. I have no clue, but actually this is true. When he was visiting the Queen of Spain, Lula left the car, closed it, and her wife was there, and the King of Spain was the responsible for opening the door to her. Diplomatic gaffe that I imagine that Lula was a little bit nervous to meet the king, but this is of course no excuse for this diplomatic gaffe. Another true or false question, perhaps the last one. Brazil was sued before the International Court of Justice, the UN court, for intervening in matters within domestic jurisdiction of an American country. I am not referring here to Dominican country. Is it true or false? Probably happened. True, true. There is a majority going to the true. Yes, Jadi, it's true. I think it would be true. Cecilia is also right. It was the Honduras case. It was one of diplomatic, as you know, at Brazil, the asylum, diplomatic asylum, when a Latin American country received in its embassy a person prosecuted or facing problems in his or her country. It happened in 2018 during the Zelaya government in Honduras, and this created a diplomatic incident. And Brazil was even brought before the International Court of Justice to serve the issue. And this is the kind of tradition that you can see in other parts of the world. For instance, you have the Assange, the Snowden, and you have other situations of diplomatic asylum, the asylum in the headquarters of a state embassy or a consulate, and this was an incident that Brazil had. So just to show you that this idea of non-intervention and non-interference sometimes can be contested in Brazilian practice. I have shown you two examples, perhaps the most important examples, where states behave in a way that is not necessarily in accordance with principles. The proceedings before the court were suspended because Brazil and Honduras reached an amicable solution. Another question is, a Brazilian president canceled the visit to the US after she discovered that US authorities have been spying on her. Is it true or false? We are on time, perfect. False, 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 true, false, true. They all spy on each other, says Wendy, which perhaps is right. True, 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 true. Sounds like it could be true. Actually, the majority is right. At the time, not Obama necessarily, that was more or less the diplomatic excuse. It was not the government, it was the agencies of the government, and Dilma was spied during that government. So this was from 2011 to 2016. Dilma was the president of Brazil, as you already know, and one of the most sensitive moments of the relationship of Brazil with the US was this public discovery. One thing is that what Wendy says, they always spy on each other. But if it's not public, if you don't know, it's more difficult. So at the time, the HuffPost word posted this, guess who's not coming for dinner? It was one of the reactions, diplomatic reactions for this spying activity. Let's go back to the less interactive part of our class, that is the military dictatorship period from 64 to 85. These are 20 years of foreign policy, which are very difficult, very variable. So it's difficult to say that it was everything the same during these 20 years. You know that every government, every year of a government can have an impact in a country's foreign affairs, but there are some common elements and some interesting issues that we should mention here. Brazil at the time was called of conducting a policy of sub-imperialism. It was the most important interlocutor of the US at the region. The region was faced with several coup coup d'etat supported by the US, and Brazil was one of the main interlocutors at the time, and Brazilian diplomacy was also responsible for stimulating this kind of policies in the governments. So there was a policy of alignment and non-alignment, but usually Brazil at the time was quite close to the US in its foreign policy, and there was no kind of approach to the Soviet Union or even China at the time. It was more at the end of the dictatorship that this started. During the President Geisel government, we had development in an important kind of relationship that is a South-South relationship. Brazil opened itself to Africa and other neighborhoods at the time. Brazil was facing a difficult situation with Argentina because of the Itaipu. Itaipu is a energetic, the word is, I'm missing my word. My English is failing right now. After 1 hour and a half speaking, I have no English anymore. Can I speak only in Portuguese in the next 20 minutes, Luciana? I will not do that. Age of Democracy on Netflix. That's true, Simi, that's true. The power plant, Itaipu power plant, hydroelectric power plant. So at the time, Brazil and Paraguay made this agreement that involves water courses coming from that are shared by Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. And Brazil did not consult Argentina as much as it should have, neither Brazil nor Paraguay. And this, of course, when you, in the upper part of the river, you block the water, the lower part of the river, that was the Argentinian part, would suffer from this decision. And this created a diplomatic tension between the two states that ended in the beginning of the, not ended, but it was more or less dissipated in the beginning of the 80s, because the beginning of the 80s was the moment of reopening of Brazil and reopening for democracy. Of course, this tension with Argentina had also a question of competing for nuclear power. At the time, Brazil was not part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Brazil only entered the Non-Proliferation Treaty in the Fernando Henrique Cardoso in 1990 something, 1998 perhaps. And at the time, there was a competition of and a fear that the other would pursue an energetic policy that would foster the technology for developing nuclear energy, but not also, but also nuclear weapons, which Brazil never had. But at the time, there was this fear in relation to our hermanos, Itaipu power plant. Yes, thank you very much, Luciana. Usina de Itaipu, it's what came to my mind. Of course, at the time, human rights was a very strong and problematic issue, especially in the most tough parts of Brazilian dictatorship. But this is something that still are ringing right now, because, for instance, the Herzog case, the murder of Vladimir Herzog, a journalist that was tortured and killed by the Brazilian secret policy at the time, still nowadays have a process, international process before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So human rights are not our forte at that moment in history, even if in the end of dictatorship, there was more attention from Brazilian authorities and government to participate on the debates of human rights that reached the international level. That's the reason why in Europe, you have the European Court of Human Rights that started its activities in the 60s, but since we were in a situation of dictatorship, our system of human rights under the Organization of American States, the Inter-American System of Human Rights, only started activities in the 80s and the 90s effectively. So this is more or less what happened in the Latin American general situation regarding human rights. We enter the redemocratization process, and Juliana Ovin has explained to you a very important issue relating the new constitution, 1988 constitution. And there is a very important part of that constitution that establishes the Brazilian principles on foreign affairs. Here is the part of Constitution that I'm talking about. Article 4 of the Constitution defined the constituent representative. They discussed deeply what would be in our legal document regarding foreign policy, and these principles are a good photograph of what Brazil summarized from past experience and what is nowadays, or at least until a certain moment of our history, Brazilian legal obligations or legal parameters under international level. First, in the national independence, this idea that Brazil is not influenced or not directly aligned, we are independent, we should maintain our relations with independence and impartiality, and this means also that Brazil is not dependent, cannot be controlled, is not a colony, and this is a very important value. The prevalence of human rights became a very important value in 1988 Constitution, and our from 88 to 2010 Brazilian politics on 2012 perhaps. Brazilian politics on human rights have been a strong one. We adhere to most important treaties on human rights and most important decisions, international decisions on human rights, and Brazil became an important defender on human rights, which is quite paradoxical, right? Because we are suffering from human rights problems until nowadays. The self-determination of people, that is the photograph of the international relations in the 20th century, which is essentially the idea that Brazil will respect independence processes. The equality of states, defending peace, the peaceful solutions of disputes, no war, no use of force, no intervention. Brazil did not take part in important wars that occurred in the 27th. Even the war on terror, Brazil had a very shy participation. Terrorism and racism are something that should be combated at international level, and political asylum. And look at the last topic of our Article 4. The Federative Republic of Brazil will seek the economic integration, political, social, and cultural of the Latin American people, with a view of construction community of Latin American nations. The idea of Brazilian integration that in the 90s was the motor of Mercosur, more or less influenced from what happened in the European context, became an important policy and reached during the government of Lula da Silva the idea of UNASUR, the community of Latin American community of Latin American nations, of South American nations, not Latin, South American nations, reached its most important level, and under Bolsonaro, Dilma and Bolsonaro, this idea disappeared. Of course, I told you, I cannot enter all the topics, I cannot enter all the issues, our time is already running, but some important things about what happened in Lula's time and Dilma's time, in order to understand what's happening nowadays. To some extent, Lula continued Cardoso's foreign policy, especially the economic policies, not neoliberal policies with privatizations and so on and so forth, how happened in Cardoso's government, but we had this idea of autonomy through the diversification. Brazil started to look at different partners, Brazil started to look at BRICS, Brazil started to reinforce its relations with its neighborhoods, and it deepened regional integration. The idea of Mercosur was reinforced, but since Mercosur had a very strong and a very deep relationship with economical issues, Brazil wanted also a political integration. Brazil wanted to create a kind of European Union in the South American communities. Brazil at the same time diversified its interests, reinforcing the idea of BRICS, reinforcing the alliance with the emerging powers in the world. Brazil, in that moment, was very strong in the idea of Security Council. Brazil wanted a permanent seat and defended it strongly. This policy did not have a good result, but that was the time when Brazil fought strongly for participating at the Security Council. Right now, Brazil is in the Security Council, but in this rotative mandate of 3 years. And Brazil also wanted to demonstrate its importance, its puissance in participating in international missions under the UN hat, which is a more legitimized participation in the world affairs. Brazil led the presence in Haiti, and Brazil also had important generals in participating in the Congo missions of the United Nations. This time was described as a moment where Brazil opened and participated strongly at international level, which of course does not come without criticism, but in our general lines in relation to openness, participation, and acquiring prestige in the international scene, it was a government that has more successes than failures. There are failures. There have been some criticism for diversifying too much, of not putting attention in our traditional partners, on risking a strained relationship with Iran, as I told you. So there are, of course, a huge amount of criticism, as it happens in recent governments. Why? Because our foreign policy became more involved in politics. With the groups governing Brazil at the time, you could see even clearer how foreign policy was connected to the plans of a specific party that was in power at the time. So the idea of Itamaraty of neutrality, that up to a point, up to the 80s, was more or less the rationale, gave space to a politics more connected to the plans of this presidential diplomacy. The president would be responsible for developing diplomacy, which does not work if you have a president that does not believe in diplomacy. That was the main criticism that Dilma Rousseff's government suffered during her years in power. There was a retreat from international crisis before the economic and political crisis that struck Brazil in 2014. There was austerity in the Itamaraty. They were cutting the budget. Michel Temer, when he entered, or gave a coup for some, entered the government, he aligned himself to policies of reform and to put again Brazil on the tracks of economy. OCDE was our main goal during the Temer years, and then we have the current situation that are still going on, but we can have some words about the foreign policy under Bolsonaro. And more or less, we have covered already when I explained to you the 5. I'm finishing, Luciana. Do not criticize me too much. When I mentioned to you the 5 challenges that we face nowadays. First, there is an automatic alignment with the US. Our president even said to Mr. Trump, "I love you, Mr. Trump," and Mr. Trump responded with an embarrassed smile. And you can find this bizarre moment in YouTube also. We have the situation of Venezuela, where Brazil took a decision to support Guaido and support and start not a war. There's no war, but start to use diplomacy against Maduro. There has been sanctions to Maduro government, which Brazil participated. There has been strong support for the opposition, and the situation of Maduro is something that Brazil put himself in a specific side of the conflict. There is for me, the worst part of all this situation is the anti-globalism, the negationist ideas. The anti-globalism is more or less the ideas that all that comes from international levels, international organization should be disengaged. Brazil should avoid incorporating standards from abroad. Brazil should not accept the idea of climate change without contesting it. And we have even this strange declaration from Ernesto Araújo, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that was the most important representative of this kind of thinking. He was the boss of Itamaraty at the time. He changed a lot Itamaraty. He changed the policies of Itamaraty. He changed the traditional function of Itamaraty to support the executive ideas without questioning, without seeing the whole of the world, the role of Brazil in the world at the time. And he said, contesting the idea of climate change as a scientific-based phenomenon, he said, "Oh, I do not see that climate change is that true, because I was in Rome last May, and it was cold, so climate change cannot be true. This kind of very well scientific, well-informed opinion. There was also a weakness in international environmental policies, which is, of course, a reflect on our national policies on the issue. During the Ernesto Araújo moments in the Itamaraty, he was sacked some months ago, and there was a conflict with China. There were some declarations, especially from the son of the president, that was at the time responsible in the Senate for conducting for an important commission on foreign affairs and foreign policy. He said that there was a Chinese virus, and he said that China was responsible for the pandemic, which of course there was this tweet diplomacy nowadays. You have reactions on Twitter, you have the answer from this kind of attack on Twitter by the ambassador of China in Brazil. He said, regrettably, you are a person without international vision nor common sense, without knowing the China or the world. We advise you that do not run to become the voice of the US in Brazil because if you do that, you have the chance to commit big mistakes. This is a very blunt kind of declaration from an ambassador to do it on Twitter to this kind of course, this was to Bolsonaro's son. It was not to Bolsonaro's government, but he is a senator and an important participant of the foreign policy of Brazil. We are facing a full tackling of the pandemic. You know that Brazil was not doing so well now with the vaccination after a lot of problems of accepting the pandemic, accepting the vaccination. Brazilian foreign policy finally are more or less changing in this regard, and we had a redefinition of the role of Itamaraty, and we have anonymous chronicler. We have this chronicler that tells the story of what's happening in the background of Itamaraty. He wrote every week a chronicle what's happening, and without giving his name, of course, but criticizing what is going on in this very important institution for the conducting of foreign policy. So we are in a moment of challenge, and if you consider that at the time during the Trump government, Bolsonaro made declarations recognizing Israel, Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. We had a lot of situations that Brazil was aligning directly to the US foreign policy, which conducted under Trump was open to criticism. So what future? Which are the conclusions that I can give you to this class? Brazil is quite aware of its role as a necessary and intermediary power and the intermediary nation in the region. But now we have a politicization of foreign policy. The idea of let's continue to defend the state and of government changed a lot in the last governments in Brazil. We are still searching for recognition and prestige, which of course this implies a connection between national and foreign policy. We have strong and insurmountable challenges that lie ahead of us, and we have to continue to work on dealing and tackling all that 5 problems that I mentioned to you in the beginning of our class. Again, who can have an opinion on foreign affairs? Everyone. That is the point of this class. That's the reason why we open to you our foreign affairs and why I ask you to understand your own foreign affairs, because this is a way to reinforce your opinions. If you understand what happened in Brazil, if you understand our relations with the big powers, the function wants to perform in the world scenario, this is more or less what I have. You can compare and you can understand better the world, and you can become better citizens that have a view on international relations. Do not keep the international relations in the hands of those in power. International relations is part of politics, and being part of politics is part of the function that every one of you has to develop in the world. I will end my lesson with 4 advices to you for the future. Again, there is no monopoly of good ideas. Internationalization, relation to other societies, countries and cultures is a good idea. This is the motto of every class of our summer school. If you unveil Brazil's relationship with others and discover yourself and your country in the process, you are a better citizen. Different problems help you to understand different backgrounds, and this is what we need in future leaders, in future persons that understand the world. They're understandable and learn how to work in a multicultural level. Improve your language skills. You don't know what tomorrow is going to be and the opportunities it keeps for you. So it's time to, you now have Portuguese in your assets. You can read a little of Portuguese. Now you are, in these 2 weeks, you learn a bit more in relation to of linguistics and language skills. And my last advice to you is enjoy Belo Horizonte in the near future, because this is something that is already part of you. I leave to you my email if you have any questions. Unfortunately, I did not prepare so much time for questioning, but I would be very pleased to answer you directly if you want. You have my Twitter there also, so feel free to write me and to pose your questions, because it will be a great pleasure. Enjoy Belo Horizonte, enjoy Brazil in the future as you enjoyed in these last 2 weeks. 2 pieces of advice for you. Answer, do the homework, because these are important for the organization of our summer school. And the second point is, we have an evaluation activity to you that we would be very pleased that you give your feedback. This project, the project of the summer school, is an ongoing project that we are refining every year. We are improving every year. So if you give the advice and you can answer this evaluation, we would be very grateful to you. And that's why, Luciana and Marcos, I will leave to you for giving the explanation of how this evaluation would work. But I thank you very, very much. I really enjoyed all this this morning. I enjoyed your participation, and I enjoyed very much to be here with you. And I hope that it was not too quick, but again, this is how we work in this bizarre pandemic. Thank you very much.
Professor, thank you ever so much. It's always an honor to have you at our summer school. And it's not, of course, by chance that you are the coordinator for this great program, right? Thank you so much for your words and your insightful presentation. And I mean, we have had such wonderful past 15 days. You've been following us on the chat, and you know everything we've been through. This year, we had the opportunity to have this magnificent 2 weeks with top-notch names. We had interesting people from different parts of the world even, right? And we had the opportunity to have some artistic views on Brazil. And then we had yesterday scientists talking with us. And then we had people from different fields of knowledge. And this year was very special because it was such a big edition of the summer school. And this is only possible, and we can get better every year, and we can reach out to more people, and we can, enhance our internationalization project at WFMG together with the world, because you help us out building better editions over the years, right? So that's, we started out with an edition with like 30 people or 20 some people. And now we have from like 4 or 5 different countries. And then now we have this huge thing that, reaches out for over 100 people, or maybe 125 people, I guess, Jessica could correct me if I'm mistaken. So it's very, very important. Jessica has shared in the chat box, maybe because everybody says, thank you, muito obrigada. People are speaking Portuguese to you, Professor Lucas. Thank you very much. And then Jessica, she has shared with you a link that we still have 4 minutes before class is over. And that's exactly what we have spared for you to go there now so that because sometimes we forget or sometimes we leave it for later and then we never actually do have a chance to answer the form. And so it's a report on what you can say whatever you want really and what we can do to get better. What you found was very interesting, what you found we could improve on, your expectations. Also say what was good, right? So that we can repeat over the years and next year and other editions. And although we still have two other sessions, right? We have one last Portuguese session later in a few minutes. And then we have our luau. We have lots of people who have signed in for the luau, and we have exclusive content in our luau, and poems and songs and dances, and we have a game. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and it will be the opportunity for us to, get together and speak. We'll leave the microphones open so you can chat, right? Better than the classes, which are a little bit more strict. And so I would invite you to come to our luau as well. Marcos, please, what would you like to emphasize?
Well, first I would like to thank Professor Lucas Lima for the class, and also thank everybody, all of our talents from all around the globe here. And well, we have our class at 11:30, our last class of Portuguese for foreigners. So I'm looking forward to see everybody there. And I guess that's it. Thank you, everybody.
Excellent. And then for those of you who are saying that can't make it to the luau, we will have this hidden link until next week so that you can join us. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, and then Alfie says he can't make it to the luau, but he sent a video. Some people are not being physically there, but they sent videos. So we'll have, it's a very diverse presentations we're gonna have, okay? So please go there now, and we'll be back here in the classroom in a few minutes, right, Marcos? For Portuguese
Yes.
class. Okay.
Yes, that's right,
So
Luciana.
thanks again. Let's go to the Google form. And do you want to say your final words, Professor Lucas? I was going to say your last words.
Thank you for killing me. But I think
hopefully not, right?
I hope you all enjoyed everything. It was a program that we carefully prepare for you, and I have no words. I'm sorry for preparing a very long class, but I think that we had time to interact in the chat.
We interacted a lot.
Yeah, I enjoyed it very much. It was again a pleasure, and I hope to meet you in person in Belo Horizonte in the future when we visit that refugee.
2022. We're waiting for everyone, right? Okay,
Have
guys.
a good day.
You too. Bye-bye. Thank you. I'll see you in a bit.